dang complicated, you know, man. It's like a dang old Rubik's Cube, man. You like talking about that blue, red, man, then you get to one side and like messed up.
All right, George Bagby, welcome back to the show. How you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks a lot for having me back.
Well, great. And before we launch into it, just a couple of housekeeping things. I won't bore you guys with the gory details, but I will say I'm pretty sick, so I'm going to be a little bit more reserved than normal. So don't expect me in top form, so to speak. But that said, the reason I invited you back, Bagby, is because obviously our last show, which is one that I really enjoyed, was kind of on the nature of America and American culture. And that was kind of looking forward to a debate, a discussion, whatever you want to call it, on Academic Agent's channel, between Furious Pertinax, Yiz, and Paul, who are all, to one degree or another, friends of the channel. And I think all of us, have been kind of aware of the discourse around, America, the global American empire, American culture. And I think that you and I both were, not particularly happy with how that discussion went. And obviously, before we get into this is in no way like a personal slight on any of these guys. And Yiz, I like all of them. They're all, friendly to me. And, by virtue of the fact that they're not here, this is going to be an abstract view of their opinions. We might get some things wrong. But all the same, I think that we wanted to have a discussion about that.
Absolutely. You remember I got in touch with you about interviewing on your show because of this issue originally. And I'm still very interested in it. We have a common duty. All people have a basic duty to honor their heritage in some sense. I think we could call this a virtue of patriotism. That really is a kind of responsibility. It's a basic thing that people need. And if we hate where we came from, if we hate our own ancestors, it destroys us. There's a writer who I really love, a Russian dissident, a Christian historian named Berdayev, Nikolai Berdayev, and he was exiled by the Bolsheviks and such. He's a very interesting fellow, and I've done a lot of work on him. But he said something very succinct about this. He said, "Without the love of country, a man is unable to create." And it does not seem coincidental to me that in this stage of the history of the West, family formation is falling apart. People are walking away from any sense of responsibility to raise the next generation. People are voluntarily sterilizing themselves in huge numbers. All of these things really are connected, and it is based in an attitude and a kind of loyalty to the patrie, right? The native land. Patrie, we can translate that from the French as fatherland, if you will. The words are related. Patrimony, paternity, all of these things are all connected linguistically. People feel alienated from their homes. People feel separated from their ancestors. People have antipathy towards their ancestors in their homes. And this is not just an American phenomenon. We remember a couple of summers ago the phenomenon of mobs taking to the streets and pulling down the statues and the rest of it. And that has not stopped. That was only the opening movement of a broader campaign. But this is going on across the West. It's not just Americans. I remember meeting German college students back when I was in graduate school and talking with them about their heritage, because I knew enough to know that Germany was a substantial place that was deserving of respect and love. And yet my German college-age peers could only dunk on their heritage. That was all they could say about it. And these chickens are coming home to roost, if you will. That a society that does not honor their fathers and their mothers, a society that actively hates their own ancestors, is a society without a future. So I'm deeply invested in this issue. I think it's a basic responsibility of a humanities teacher, which is what I am, to cultivate these kinds of loyalties. And it's an uphill battle these days. But this is the discussion. AA's cigar stream, Academic Agent's cigar stream just recently was a debate about that question. And I wanted to return to that once again, kind of to go through the talking points of that debate and see what we can make of it. I'm going to say something potentially very unpopular here. Once Academic Agent had a chance to clarify some of his more controversial choices in wording, let's say, he did publish a series of syllogisms outlining his argument for the cigar stream. I found that distillation of his basic argument very illuminating. And it wasn't the cigar stream itself which had its problems. It was his syllogisms that, and his clarifications, I must say, that have left me in a peculiar situation with some qualifications, and I would want to clarify, and I'd want some disclaimers along the way. I will announce myself in agreement with Academic Agent's argument.
I think I find myself in a similar position to you, and I've said multiple times that I felt kind of unsatisfied with what I felt was kind of a Mott and Bailey move, and maybe these are unrelated conversations that got pulled into one another, because I feel like at first there was kind of the discussion about American culture, which I felt to a certain degree kind of baited by. And that was things that obviously all of us on these side of things agree kind of the debased nature of culture across the West, Jersey Shore and, and Lizzo and, other kind of like things of that nature. And so it was frustrating kind of feeling like you were getting blamed for something you obviously don't support. And so I think that got a lot of people's hackles up. It made a lot of people angry, and it caused a lot of people to kind of reactively, say things they probably didn't mean or disagree with things that they ordinarily would. Because honestly, and I've said multiple times, even talking to the Norwegian guys, over at Longhouse, that I can't help but kind of agree with European anti-Americanism. I find myself in agreement with AA's written arguments, not necessarily kind of like the ones he put up on Twitter or Telegram.
Indeed. And when we talk about American cultural influence over Europe, we are usually talking about the cultural exports of the degeneracy that we are at such pains to combat and counteract here on our own shores. We don't like American cultural influence on Europe. We do not like American cultural imperialism in Europe. And I don't really know how this works, how the American political influence or military occupation of Europe has to do with the cultural export to Europe. But this is one of those points that I wonder, why would we contend on that issue? As an American, I have nothing invested in the garrisons kept in Europe. I think that the American empire is wasteful and presumptuous. The United States government does not have any mandate to police the world. The United States government has no mandate to occupy Europe or tell Europe what to do. And I'm willing to take the argument from our British friends. Tell me, is Furious Pertinax British? Because I don't actually know.
He's Australian, I believe.
Okay. I thought I was,
which is an odd mix.
I thought that I was getting better at distinguishing the Australian accent, and it turns out that I'm not. So Much love and respect to you folks. I love the way that you talk, but I can't distinguish one from the other. Well, with respect to our British friends, when they say that the American garrisons in Europe are forcing the British and the Germans and whoever else to do things against their political interests, I agree. They're doing things against their political interests. They are likely to be experiencing blackouts in the middle of the winter. They're unlikely to be able to heat their homes this winter because they are so obviously acting against their essential interests as sovereign countries, as traditional nations who supposedly have governments representing their interests. I don't know how else to explain that other than they're obviously under the control of their enemies. Our British friends would like to blame DC on the same grounds that DC hates the likes of us and wants to destroy us culturally as well, wants to destroy our religious adherents, wants to corrupt our children. They speak openly on these things. I don't know, and with respect to our American friends in this argument, I don't know why they would be unwilling to admit that and to make concessions and declare a kind of common cause. The DC regime is the enemy of the dissident right. They openly declare themselves to be so. And it seems to me that AA's assertion that we should have a common cause to clear them out, which in our case means wanting the dissolution of the regime in Washington, D.C., ought to be something we can agree on, American or not. Now, we Americans have taken exception to academic agent's rhetoric in his choice of words. AA keeps saying America is cancer and America has no culture and America is a made-up nation and things like that. Okay? He has since qualified himself. I think he said those things to stir things up, and my goodness, didn't he? It was very successful to stir things up and to tick us off, rile us up. But he has since qualified himself. He says that at best, the United States is a collection of peoples. Well, I happen to be in the habit of referring to the American nations or American peoples, which may end up being some kind of regional phenomenon. So it's still not going to be like European ethnicities. And I'm not claiming that it is, but let's have that discussion later. Okay, let's shelve that.
Do you want to get in first by essentially kind of summarizing or just actually reading outright the syllogisms that he kind of started the discussion with?
Absolutely. That's a great idea. Shall I do that? I have that here.
Sure. Yes. Thank you.
Okay. So I've got AA's argument. Syllogism number 1. All true nations are built on ethnos. The United States is a propositional nation. Therefore, the United States is not a true nation. I have just clarified my position on that. Perhaps we can move on from that one.
Right.
I'm in agreement with him. The United States, when we talk about the American nation, we're talking about a propositional nation, the modern conception, which is very commonly accepted now. It's not the historic conception. At one point in our history, we would have talked about the American people, and we would have meant white Anglo-Saxon Protestants who were running things, right? Who conquered the country, named the country, created the laws of the country, so on and so forth. Up until the 1960s, they still constituted over 80% of citizens. So people could speak that way and it made more sense. And that wasn't very long ago. Paul Fahrenheit has talked about this, and kudos to him. Give him credit where it's due. I think he's correct on this point. But the idea that the United States or that Americans just believe a proposition and that's what makes them Americans, that has become mainstream. I accept that. I agree that that's a mainstream idea. I don't blame anyone who assumes that that's what Americans have always meant. You kind of have to get into the history to know otherwise. I was talking in our last stream about different narratives of American history, and that was part of my point. The propositional nation is a narrative of American history. Then the next syllogism. Propositions spread like viruses, mutating and replicating themselves on other hosts. Syllogism A. The United States is not a true nation. It's a propositional one. Third point of the syllogism. The United States is a virus that always seeks to replicate even as it mutates. So the United States, in other words, is imperial in its basic composition. The third syllogism, liberalism is moral syphilis. The United States sees it as its divine mission to spread liberalism around the world. Therefore, the United States is moral syphilis. This is AA's syllogism. So he's saying that the United States in its essential composition is a liberal internationalist project. At a certain point, it certainly becomes a liberal internationalist project. I do not deny that. That becomes the ruling regime in Washington, D.C., arguably in 1898 with the Spanish-American War, where the out-and-out imperialist party dominates the actions and foreign policy of the federal government. Now, at that point in our history, we actually still have a lot of high-quality dissenters. They are elites. These are not people that are excluded from positions of power. These are not non-political people. They are very political people. They are members of the old ruling class. They have a lot of clout. They have money. They begin a famous committee, the Anti-Imperialist League. They have publications. They have famous spokesmen like Mark Twain and such. And the anti-war tradition in the United States is still around. We still have groups like antiwar.com, which has really been keeping the light alive all of these years through the war on terror. We have people like Ron Paul, who really did strike a chord with his presidential runs, his campaigns, and of course he's still around. He did take a lot of those campaign contributions, and he's set up a media enterprise. So he is still with us, and his people are still making a difference. The anti-imperialist tradition in the American story is still something that's alive. It's still something that's vital. And I don't deny AA's point here. I just want to qualify myself. Is anyone of the opinion that there is a dissenting group of elites in power in Washington, D.C. that does not favor the American empire, that's trying to bring it all home? I'm under no illusions about this. Donald Trump did not run on an anti-imperialist platform. If anything, it was just an old-fashioned imperialist platform. I don't know if you remember when he had an interview, was it with George Stephanopoulos, where Trump said, we should have made the war in Iraq to our profit. We should have taken their oil.
I do remember that, which I hate to say it is a position that I'm not, like, I don't morally agree with, but at least it's like, well, if we're going to have an empire, you might as well get some benefit from it.
That's right.
Versus this system now, which I think that a lot of the anti-Americans have pretty successfully pointed out does not benefit Americans. The American empire is essentially run for the outgroup. And so that's why I'm partially
it is moral syphilis, and it's like a virus seeking other countries to replicate itself in.
Yeah, well, and I also am just confused the instinctual like urge to protect the American empire, because I mean I feel like the project, especially post Bush and very much in kind of like the post Obama era, it's been very clear that the empire is not for people like you and me. We're even seeing it now, specifically with the armed forces, kind of shedding its kind of like Scotch Irish Anglo core. It's that the people who made the empire for good or ill, initially are no longer the beneficiaries of it.
Indeed. And it doesn't make any kind of fiscal sense. I've seen the imperial projects of the United States as grossly immoral and a tremendous financial waste and a squandering of the goodwill, the morale, and the blood of one of our greatest assets, which is young people, young men willing to fight for it, willing to defend the flag. For what it's worth, those people should be treated as a sacred charge. They should never be sent into some nation building project that's been concocted in the Pentagon or the State Department. That is immoral, and I have believed that my entire adult life. I fully realize I'm in a minority on this. Americans are usually imperialists and take it for granted. They don't call themselves imperialists, but tell an American, let's bring the troops home. We can't police the world. Why are Americans in practically every country in the world? There is some American presence, some American military presence. We readily can list off the ones where the American military does have no troops. Russia, North Korea, China, Iran, countries like that, where we have no troops on the ground. Also, completely dysfunctional countries like Somalia, right? Where if we were there, we would be running the place. And there's really no alternative.
I will say, and this is largely aside, and this is actually a lot of the work from the antiwar.com people, that essentially the reason Somalia is the hellhole it is also largely our fault. That's fairly non-controversial, but I think that's probably outside the share of this, or outside the scope of this discussion.
Indeed. I mean, the United States government, and thanks to their insistence on this for the last 100 years, regular Americans assume that we have to have a position on every conflict on the globe, and that we have some obligation to take sides. And this is preposterous. So what comes along with the exceptional, or with the propositional nation thesis, is the exceptional nation thesis. We are not a traditional nation. We are special. We have a divine mission, as AA put it in his syllogism, some divine mandate to police the world, to resolve differences, to establish peace among the heathen, or something like that. And that's also preposterous. That's also unlimited commitment, and it's not responsible. I mean, I don't really need to say all of this, but the United States is an empire. The United States is made of many peoples. That's one of the definitions of empire. The United States has this global presence. The United States has this presumption that it can insert itself into the sovereign affairs of any country in the world and tell them what to do. thankfully, some of this stuff is breaking down. Americans will learn real limits, but I see no reason why this regime deserves to survive. AA's argument that it ought to be dissolved for these given reasons, I am in agreement with them, with some qualification. I would like to see as I said on the last stream, I'd like to see the union dissolved. I think that would be a good thing for everyone involved. I think we've gone enough through AA's argument here for me to properly qualify myself. But we return again to this question of patriotism. So patriotism does not mean that you're boosting all the actions of your government. It doesn't mean rah, 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 we want DC to win whenever they get into a fight. Patriotism means love of your place, love of the people that put you there, some affirmation of your heritage. You see something redeeming about where you came from, what you are. And this is very important because we very seldom transcend that. Homer said, the son is seldom better than his father. I think we can look at experience to bear that out. If we want to know what we can be, we look at our parents. That's the first place that we look. What are our characteristics? What can we do with our lives? Our parents give us the primary image of those things, which is one of the reasons why we're commanded in Scripture to love our father and mother. The first command given with a promise that our days may be long on the land the Lord our God has given us. So we need to take into account our circumstances so that we can see what does it mean to love this country, and what should we do under these circumstances. A writer that I love on this point, who is popular in our circles, a guy that you really ought to go and read if you haven't already, thanks to Imperial Press. He is once again readily accessible. We have an awful lot to be thankful for there at Imperial Press. They've started republishing the works of Joseph de Maistre. So go and get your copy if you haven't already. You need to read him. He's the ultimate traditional monarchist guy. He's the Roman Catholic answer to Edmund Burke. And I love Burke. But Joseph de Maistre said that the Constitution is the work of circumstances. And I'll just read a quote to you on this point. De Maistre said, "What is a constitution? Is it not merely the solution to the following problem? Given the population, the mores, the religion, the geographic situation, the political circumstances, the wealth, the good and bad qualities of a particular nation, to find the laws that suit it." We need to know what our situation is, and I regret that we're in serious decline culturally. We are not well suited to be governed by the Philadelphia Constitution anymore. It's not that we've outgrown it. It's that we've grown too small for it. We've become morally stunted. Think of what President John Adams said, that the Constitution is fit for a religious people only. It's wholly unsuited for an irreligious people. We still have a lot more religious adherence than Europe, and of course that's partly a regional phenomenon. Some parts of the country are far more religious than others. And I truly love my history. I do deeply love this country, and it does not please me to say it, but the Constitution is not limiting our government. The Constitution has failed to limit our government. And the Constitution is no longer the fit framework to rule a people such as us. And I will return back to AA's point. the Union would be best to be dissolved. Now, I realize that could mean civil war once again. What happened the last time the Union was declared dissolved, and I don't want war. I'm a reluctant radical in this sense. I'm just saying what we have doesn't work, and holding on to it out of a misplaced loyalty to our heritage and past. A mistake I'm very likely to make, by the way. I have a lot of sympathy for those in those circumstances that feel a loyalty to the old republic. My contention is that it's gone. It was dissolved in several revolutions. The Civil War, the New Deal, the Wilson administration. Maybe these things should not have happened, and we can talk about that in an academic setting, but still, they have happened. They're fait accompli. And we need to measure our circumstances now. What is fit to rule us now? On your Telegram channel a couple of days ago, I wrote a series of resolutions with this in mind, just to get some feedback from our crowd on your private chat. One of the things that I wrote was, resolved, the veneration of the Constitution at this late hour of our history has done more to paralyze than help our political allies, and thus the Constitution ought to be called a failed attempt to limit the government. And I also asked, I guess more out of curiosity, I have my own opinions about this, but we need to ask questions about what comes afterwards. Ryan Turnipseed has been insightful on this point. I'm not sure he's written at length on it, but he's at least made comments on this point, that we have to have a positive vision so that we know we aren't jumping from the frying pan into the fire. We obviously don't want things to get worse. I'm not sure that the Constitution is really helping us at this point. It's clay in the hands of the judges, right? But another resolution that I shared with your group, and I'd be very curious for feedback here, by the way, resolved, the end of the Union could lead to non-Republican forms of government.
I think it's interesting because, and Paul has made this point, and I think it's a good one, that essentially you're kind of stuck with the political baggage of your system. You're stuck with the symbols, kind of regardless of what the system becomes. And so, at least to me, right, I agree with you. I don't think that whatever comes next will be what the constitutionalists and the boomer cons want. But it's hard for me to imagine a world in which it isn't kind of at least wearing the symbols of what has kind of come before it. So recently, obviously, like I said before, I've been ill. And so what I do when I get ill is I essentially go through the Distributus backlog. It's kind of like a big playlist as I kind of like sit there and try to get better.
Now that's a wholesome thing to do.
It is. And he has a series of streams, and I missed this. I wasn't in the scene at the time, but talking essentially about propertarianism, which was a now defunct micro ideology of essentially like constitutional libertarianism. But he uses this analogy of essentially calling it a ghost dance, right? Which was something that the Plains Indians did, as kind of the U.S. military kind of like drove them from their lands, which is they essentially were like, all right, well, what did we do when we were great? And what did we do when we were powerful? Well, we did ghost dances. We did these elaborate religious ceremonies, kind of doing something that is, it's comforting to do. It's something that's kind of like embedded in the cultural memory. And it is something associated, at a time in which you were great, right? But that's not necessarily the reason you were great. There were other things, and merely kind of like aping that won't bring it back. It won't make the cavalry go away. And so to me, I feel like Constitution worship is very much the same thing. It's like, oh, well, if we just do the Constitution more, do the Constitution harder. We can essentially like stave it back. And I think that, with Demester's point, it stands, right? That essentially like a constitution, and I realize this kind of flies in the face of a lot of, like our history, especially when it comes to kind of judicial history, right? That there is really something to be said that kind of like a constitution is made for a people at a certain time.
And so much of the contention in the Supreme Court has to do with the circumstances, which ironically, it makes the leftist tradition in the Supreme Court more along the lines of de Maistre.
Right, yeah, that's what I was kind of getting at. It's an odd position to find yourself in.
Yes.
Well, so are there more syllables you want to go through?
If we cut ourselves off from the ties to the Constitution, we have no idea where we would end up. And this is partly Edmund Burke's great point. It's a very skeptical point. We might as well hold on to what we've got, because if we cast loose, we could be destroyed by far worse monsters than the ones we have here with us now. And that's a fair point. But I contend that we can't continue on this way much longer. There is some polling organization or some social research organization. I just cited their name, CSPI. I'm not sure who they are or what that stands for, but they just recently published some sort of survey of American college students. And according to their survey, 40% are identifying as LGBTQ. And of course, that does not mean that 40% are getting sterilized. But we do know that those numbers are rising very sharply. And there is a serious social contagion there. The generation that we see coming into adulthood is not going to successfully reproduce itself. That in itself, that's really catastrophic. All the talk right now is about inflation. We have very serious deflation on the horizon as well, and maybe our lords and masters know that, which is why they have inflated right now. I don't know. That's all speculation, and I have a bad track record of making those kinds of bets. But still, we're in a really bad situation. People, Americans in particular, will be seriously disillusioned with our institutions. Already, institutional trust is at record lows across the board. COVID did a lot to undermine trust in the police, trust in the medical institutions. Congress has been, rated in the single digits for a long time, for 10 years or more. What institutions do Americans really trust anymore? These things really could collapse. And here's where I think that I could actually be accused of being too optimistic. All right. I think that in my hopeful proposal to divide the Union in any way, okay, I'm not really particular about that at all. All it would take would be one state or one region to try to do it. And that would set off the other regions and states. A lot of people would get the idea as soon as anyone tried it. Just like in 1860, by the way. But that actually gives us a chance to preserve something. I am not at all of the opinion that we can realistically that we could dream or plan to seize the institutions of power in this society today. Call it the populist delusion, if you will. I don't think that it works. And if it got any traction, it would be fortified. Call me a black pillar. Okay, but let's be realistic about our situation. I don't put stock in that. I think that we either wait for it to begin to collapse and then we act, and by doing so, we can preserve some of the things that we love. We can reconstitute some institutions. I think that universities should be dissolved and reconstituted from scratch. Maybe I don't know. We wouldn't want to give them the same names they had before, but the physical plant is worth something. But you'd have to have very stringent interviews to hire back any faculty or staff compared to the universities we have now. The universities we have now turn people into transsexual socialists. Let's be clear. And that's what they're meant to do at this stage. If they aren't doing that, they are failing in their mission statements. Let's not delude ourselves.
Well, and I
the
think
same for the public school system, right? In no sense are school boards run by parents or members of the community in touch or in charge with what goes on in the public schools and the kind of propaganda and subversion that is pitched to the students. And it's wrecking them. It's rendering them not just incapable of loving their country or relating to their ancestors in a meaningful way, but it is alienating them from their parents and faith. As a teacher, I've been with public school teachers. I have heard public school teachers tell me, frankly, they understood their goals as teachers to separate children from the faith and teaching of their parents and churches. A public school teacher has formulated that clearly for me. I don't want to save those institutions. I'm not a conservative. I think I spent most of my adult life calling myself a conservative. I'm a radical. I'm not trying to save those institutions. Let them go to hell. But I love my country. I really am opening myself up to a charge of treason. And I am taking that seriously. But I do not want to be ruled by DC. The Constitution no longer suits us. Our institutions are thoroughly corrupt. And I suppose I could take a quietist approach and hope that we can survive like Amish communities on the fringes of society. But I would rather see conservative red states, if you will, strike out on their own. And obviously, if blue states did and founded socialist dictatorships or radical people's republics or something, I would actually cheer that on as well, because it would at least get us thinking about how to survive. AA had an interesting point in that stream. He said the communist experiments had a funny result in that they shored up social institutions because communism is such a bad system. The only way they could possibly survive was to shore up social institutions, which is a fair point. I mean, I'm not endorsing that, but it is a fair point.
No, I see what you're getting at, and to me that is, I think, the real dividing line. It's really kind of important between kind of the Americans in this scene. We're essentially, and I think that this really is, what we can describe as the lines between either the radicals and the conservatives or the radicals and the reactionaries. And if the idea is essentially, and this is, what I think you see with kind of like the softer edge of our movement is the idea that, well, the problem is just, we essentially went wrong somewhere in the past, 50, 100 years, and it all would have been fine if we had just kind of stuck to those, original principles. And I have a certain degree of sympathy for that. But the idea that you can essentially just go back upstream, a decade or two at a time, and then just freeze it there, that you can just be like, all right, well, we can go back to, kind of like 2000 or go back to, 1955. I'm just not convinced. And I'm a little bit confused how you can, and maybe you don't think that directly, but how you can think that in effect and still like hang out in these circles. And I don't know.
I
kind
also
of
have a lot of sympathy. I've got a lot of sympathy for what you're talking about. Go ahead.
No, and so I to a certain degree have some sympathy for that. Like you and I, obviously, you were a large intellectual influence on me. Like I grew up on Burke. I read a lot of Burke in high school, when we were in class together. And so I really like absorbed that, Reflections on the Revolution in France. That's sitting on my shelf, behind, where I record this. But to me, there's something to be said for the fact that like that is, much like a constitution, that is an idea kind of suited for a situation. That is an idea that, realistically, right, like a conservative tact made sense, in the 19th century, made sense in the 17th century. But now it's almost like, and this is not a, a particularly original point, but it's like, well, what is there left to conserve? The essentially like the post-70s economic system of us just, bullying everyone around with the petrodollar, and it's hard because I share your kind of like love for, your love for my country. It just is kind of, and so I find myself in an odd spot, like you said, kind of like dancing around this kind of like treasonous idea. And I very much find myself, in agreement with you. And it's not something that I take lightly. And it's not something that I am, I guess, comfortable with, in the sense that I think in a different time I would, be very much a patriot. But now I can't, it's hard to describe myself as such.
Well, I'm calling myself a patriot. And it's funny, I have studied and talked about the Patriots of 1776, the Patriot Party in the American Revolution, or the War for Independence. And I go through phases or cycles, and it kind of it has told me something about myself over the years. Sometimes my sympathies are very much with the Tories, the Loyalists, and I really understand where they're coming from. And I like to imagine I would be in their number if I was facing these things. And other times, like now, it was the year of the lockdowns and such. And I remember having the conversation several times that we are nothing like those men now. There is no Samuel Adams among us. If there was, there would have been more resistance to the destruction of those years. In one sense, I remember my reflection, the years of the COVID stuff was from Julius Caesar. Cassius says, "Rome, thou hast lost the breed of noble bloods." And he says, Caesar would not be a wolf if the Romans were not sheep. I remember reflecting on H.L. Mencken's reflections, or H.L. Mencken's quotes about Americans being sheep led to the slaughter, Americans being meek followers of malicious demagogues. And we ought to know that about ourselves. We ought to know our limitations, our weaknesses. But I love this country. I contend I love it. It's mine. There are perhaps other countries more lovable, more lovely. But this is mine. And I belong to it and it belongs to me, and my destiny is tied up in it. But I think that we can think of ourselves as more traditional nations, and we can imagine other political destinies for ourselves. The Constitution should not be a suicide pact. And we ought to be able to think of our destiny outside of it. We have something to fall back on, ready-made for us. That's part of our historical inheritance, and that is the states themselves. The states themselves are still political units. They do not command much loyalty from their citizens anymore. Their citizens don't necessarily identify themselves with their states anymore. They may have this ideological national conception. They may just think of themselves as Americans. They don't think of themselves in relation to their native state, but regional and state identities still do exist. And that is something that we may fall back on eventually. I hope we do.
Well, and that's something that I want to discuss, because you and I mentioned that, before we went live, that there's kind of this, and it's an understandable mistake. I probably do it myself quite often, but kind of conflating nation as in, to use a biblical example, right? Like the nation of Judah, or else that's probably triggered the chat, but you know what I mean? A nation is in like an identifiable ethnos, and then
Right.
nation state. And those are two very different things, and you've said before on the stream, right, the idea of kind of the peoples of America, that there are, multiple kind of like independent cultures that really are, and obviously they haven't essentially, really since, the last 100 years, but even before that, they haven't really been treated as such, but they really are kind of irreconcilable differences between people who live here. And that is, I think, become more and more apparent. And it is frustrating, right, when you see from your friends the kind of like Lincolnian and Wilson-esque like rhetoric that, ordinarily they would kind of disagree with. When someone punches them in the nose, they flash red and turn into Abraham Lincoln again. You see what I'm getting at?
Yes. Yeah, I certainly did see that with the whole American question in AA's sphere, as this has kind of been churning on social media. Yeah, it really does interest me that Americans have instinctively identified with the propositional nation thesis in solidarity. They were feeling defensive, and we certainly saw that on the cigar stream with AA. But you do know this about me, that definition of nation is a big pet peeve of mine. And I know that I am in the minority here. Most Americans will make nation a synonym for government. That is our accepted usage. I do not deny that. But I say that it clouds clear thinking on the subject. Now, this is actually one of the things that made people really upset with AA, when he was saying America must be destroyed and things like that, just to stir people up. When we think that the destruction of DC, well, I don't know, just regular Americans would think the destruction of the regime in DC means the destruction of us as a people. We took it to be an existential taunt or an existential threat or something. And that's not actually what he meant. And he did clarify himself on that. He said he has nothing against regular Americans, right? He did say that clearly and several times. And he said his beef is with the American regime, which he would remind us is our cultural enemy. They're avowedly so, right? And electing Trump didn't do anything about that, by the way. Just back to my point, what is a nation? A nation is a distinct group of people. Again, this Russian guy that I like so much, Berdayev, he said that a nation isn't made of one blood kindred. It's not made of one language. It's not made of one religion or one geographical region. Nations don't have all of these things align for them. A nation can be dispersed over several countries, jurisdictions. A nation can have more than one language. A nation can have more than one religion. But he said the thing that does unite a nation is a beautiful thought. He said a oneness of historical fate. That's what unites a nation. And I suppose with that definition, we could talk about an American nation to a degree. But as you said, the ethnic tension, the ethnic element, remains a very distinct division in America today, in our political discourse, in our demographics, in our geographic distribution, many different reasons why it remains a major issue still today. And I would like to suggest, once again, kind of going along my point previously, I think that there is some kind of solution to be found in a regional reorganization, or I don't think it's going to follow state lines exactly, but at least state governments give us a way to organize ourselves politically past the shelf life of the union, the federal government. Well, and we might have some kind of national identity based in place and shared destiny in that place. That really is something to build on. No one can imagine the South without its ethnic mixture, if I can be clear on that. This is why the Ku Klux Klan is ultimately an ideological dream or something. It's not even very Southern in that sense.
You mean the first or second?
The second and third. The second and I suppose the one that still exists, I suppose, as some arm of the FBI.
But no, carry on. I want to hear you explain that.
Oh, about the KKK or something else?
So why is it an ideological project?
Because it is an obsession with one racial admixture in the southern region. Well, with the second KKK, it really was a white nationalist organization, and it was stronger in the North and the West than it was in the South, strangely enough. And it seemed to be much more concerned about Catholics and Jews than it was about Black people, because there were hardly any Blacks in Oregon, for instance. But that was where the KKK took over the state government. I don't think that it's a coincidence that Oregon is a center of wokeness today, when it was a KKK bastion in the 1920s. I think the ideological politics is a virus, to follow the metaphor that Academic Agent gave us. And I think it may have worked itself out in Antifa today, where it was, KKK terrorism back in the 1920s or something. It's funny, the second iteration of the Ku Klux Klan never took over a southern state government.
Well, that's always
it took over several northern ones.
Well, that's always the thing that I found so odd, is that, and this is a digression, but people always assume it, very much like they associate it, with like Alabama, Mississippi, largely because of, the first KKK, the Reconstruction era one. But if you look at, I think the largest percentage of population involved in the Klan was Connecticut. which is
Yes.
almost laughable when you say it. You think of Connecticut now, right? And it's like Mystic Pizza and, kind of like New York bedroom communities. And then imagining, and I'm a firmly, anti-Tarantino person, but you can imagine, Django Unchained taking place in Connecticut, and it's a completely comical idea.
Indeed, it is very ironic.
So is there anything else you want to say as we kind of reach time about, the stream, or more things you want to address?
Well, I guess I did want to say one other thing.
And if you have time, I can go longer. I realize you have real world responsibilities, but I can stay a little bit later.
Yeah, I did want to talk a bit in detail about things that were actually said during the cigar stream, and I want to give everyone their due. Obviously, it's like a 3.5-hour stream, so we aren't going to go very far on that. But let's start with one issue, and we can just consider it for a moment. The question of the British Empire came up. Obviously, this was a debate between Americans, a Britisher, if we can call AA a Britisher. Please, AA, don't take me to being condescending or something. Oh, I'm just mentioning your origin. I don't know if Britisher is taken to be condescending or not, but sometimes we call you that here in the South. The question of the British Empire was debated. AA said that the British Empire left ethnic hierarchies in place when it went around the world. And he said that was in contrast to the American Empire, which was always subverting hierarchies and filling people with liberal ideology and such. But I did want to offer a retort to that. I agree that post 1898, after the American Empire is kind of informally declared with the Spanish-American War, there was a previous tradition to that. And that was one that was actually more imperial along British lines. It was things like the Indian reservations out west, which had a way of preserving distinct national groups. And we still call them, we still call them the nations today. The Indian reservations, we still colloquially refer to those areas as the nations, which I think is a good little clue in our common usage in America today of actually the true meaning of that word, nation, a distinct ethnic group. But anyway, that question of the British Empire is an interesting one. I think Clossington is going to have a stream about that soon, about whether or not the British Empire was a progressive enterprise. Did you see something about that?
I did. This is somewhat embarrassing. I was not involved in these spheres when Clossington kind of disappeared the first time around, so I didn't realize that he was an active producer until very recently. But I've been catching up on his work, and I'm very excited for that stream. I'm looking forward to it.
Well, I am too, because I hear people talking about him, but like you, I never really I never really caught him on streams or anything, so I don't really know what he stands for. But I read some of his content and I like it, so I'm interested too. Our friend Charlemagne opined about the cigar stream and said that the argument between the Americans and the Britishers on the American presence in Europe in particular was pitiful, he said. I believe that's the word that he used. Charlemagne sided with our American friends, Paul Fahrenheit, for instance, in this exchange with AA. AA was blaming the American presence in Europe for various specific troubles that Europe is having right now. Specifically, I suppose, foreign policy choices that are not favoring the populations of Europe. I say fair enough. Why not be conciliatory? Why not make concessions? After all, Europe really is in for some serious suffering in the near term. Why not make concessions on this point? But I'm not condemning Paul. Paul had a very spirited position, and Paul came back saying, those Europeans really love those American subsidies. Europe has not had to defend itself since the end of World War II. European armies are jokes, basically. They have not been investing in technology or human resources for a couple of generations now. And those Europeans just want to take advantage of Americans. And if the Americans, or no, if the Europeans had decided to rearm and actually reconstitute their armed forces, there would be little the Americans could do to stop it. Our friend Charlemagne seconded Paul on that, is what I understand. He said that if Germany was to assert its foreign policy, if Germany was to rebuild an army, the United States couldn't do anything about that. Well, maybe so. And I'm very frustrated with countries like Germany right now. It doesn't seem to me that they deserve to be called a representative government in any sense. They seem to have been hijacked, maybe by American-funded enterprises, ultimately, maybe by subversion from the State Department. Why not? The State Department has been running things in Europe for quite a while, so far as I can tell. But my point is, why not give our Europeans some concessions on these points? Do we Americans on the dissident right actually want the American military in Europe? Do we want the American military or the State Department making policy in Europe? No. Do we want American cultural exports? Like, why even dignify to name them? No, we don't. We don't want Europeans drinking more Coca-Cola. Let them drink beer. We don't want them eating Dunkin' Donuts. Let them eat their cake, which is far better, right? To make a play on words.
No, I agree, and it's actually a big part of the reason I've been talking a lot with the Norwegian guys about this, where it's like there is, and this is like the idea behind global homo, right? Like there is a homogenization, an Americanization, and that's both negatively affected us. Where I live, right? And you can see the difference in essentially pre and post empire architecture. Post empire architecture is horrible. Okay, maybe you can say that the FDR era stuff had a certain amount of soul to it, but almost immediately after, kind of like the War of World Conquest, it just all went to, it all went to hell. And you see that kind of like forced on everyone else, this kind of, like horrible, shapeless, modern and postmodern architecture. So I very much see what you're getting at. And I don't know. It's why I say like if I were a European, I would be anti-American, and proudly so.
Well, I wonder if we could make a comparison between the global American empire, as we like to call it, or the empire of lies, which really is a very good term for it. I'm in full agreement with that term. I wonder if we could make any comparison between that and the empires of Europe at the cusp of World War I. One historian called them the sleepwalkers. Was that Clark Carlton? Is that his name?
I'm not sure, but carry on.
It's a big book about World War I that I want to read and I haven't. But it's a popular thesis that the empires of Europe were somnambulant giants that walked into conflict with one another. Maybe the Gay is also a sleepwalking empire. Maybe it is a malicious zombie empire. You know what they have in common? They do not have a operating mind. They're brainless.
One of
And if
my
we look
favorite analogies for this, I stole from someone in kind of the more libertarian sphere, which is they essentially described, the U.S. government as a 100-foot tall baby with a chainsaw, and the idea is that it's not smart, it's not stable. It's going to come over, it's going to fall over eventually. But if it catches you and it grabs you in its hands, you're done. And there's no like hive mind of like hyper intelligent room in a men in a back room smoking cigarettes planning it all out. It's just kind of this like incredibly powerful and incredibly poorly directed force. But carry on.
It's horrific. It's incredibly immoral. And if the American people, not to be too populist about it, but Americans are horribly informed about these things. They do not get good information about the actions of the empire, and they have no historical awareness of what their military has done around the world in their name. And they're absolutely mystified when they hear that Americans are unpopular in various places around the world. They have no idea why. And yes, call them infantile and call them irresponsible for not taking the trouble to learn, right? Mark Twain, the anti-imperialist, he said, God made war to teach Americans geography. And that's a very good point. Americans really rarely know what their country is doing around the world. And occasionally they read about a war and they find a country on a map and they go, oh, that's where Ukraine is. But it's really dreadful to reflect about what the American empire has done over the years. What they did in Iraq, Iraq was destabilized. A civil war broke out because the United States abolished the government and military of the country of Iraq, though the country had done nothing aggressive towards the United States. It had not attacked the United States. It had not threatened the United States. And as a result of the abolition of the government and military of Iraq, the country was plunged into a civil war that lasted over 10 years. Arguably, it's still going on now. The country was partially partitioned. It hasn't been formally partitioned, but it's not operating as a unitary state anymore. And I believe I want to say it's the United Nations estimate. I can tell you that the number is not overblown. The number is not controversial. To my knowledge, this number is not controversial. Over 1 million civilians died in the course of the Iraqi Civil War. The United States empire is responsible for that. Americans don't know the first thing about it. There aren't any Christians in Iraq anymore. Before 2003, 10% of the country was Christian. The foreign minister of Iraq was a Christian. His name was Tariq Aziz. He was an Assyrian Christian. I believe Roman Catholic. That would make him. It is a terrible injustice what the United States has done with these countries, and they have done it out of an absence of mind. They have done it because they have their head in the clouds full of ideological dreams about remaking the world in their image. And there's a price to pay for these things. I tremble for my country when I think of these things. Americans will suffer for these horrible, unethical actions. And I don't want them to suffer for it. And for heaven's sake, they had no idea. And they didn't come up with the plan. It was our criminal elites who seem to be, some combination of criminal and insane, all too obvious now, where we actually have, a demented old man in the White House who cannot string sentences together. And the same goes for his most unfortunate selection for the vice presidency. These people do not have much awareness of what's going on themselves. The United States does not elect its leadership. We ought to know this about ourselves. We don't have a representative government. The people that we supposedly elect in the most fortified, secure elections are not actually the people that go run the country. There is a permanent elite that does not get switched out. And when Trump is elected, they actively subvert him. We know this to be true. We ought to all know this to be true now. We don't actually have the government that we claim to have. But going back, I did say I was going to read some of the actual interactions on the cigar stream. I think we might have covered this. I think I did just cover that. Let me go further back. I apologize. Okay. AA on one occasion, he said, European empires were not anti-European. I've got a response to that. That was so, at least until they collapsed. And then those sophisticated Brits were supporting, Indian terrorist actions against imperial outposts in India after World War II and like cheering on Gandhi and stuff like that. AA likes to blame Americans for that. He likes to say, oh, well, that's American cultural rot that's being exported into Great Britain. I'm not totally convinced of that. Do you have any opinion on that? Like the collapse of European empires? Do you think that when their own people were cheering on anti-colonial dissolution of their own old imperial patrimony, do you think that was an American thing, or do you think that was homegrown?
Well, I mean, it's hard because, and I realize I'm not a historian. I'm less knowledgeable than you are. But the opinion I've kind of formed is essentially that the empire kind of fell into America's lap, so to speak. If you look at kind of the First World War as essentially this, massively destructed, essentially intergroup conflict. We're essentially like the last remnants of the empires of Europe, which were, let's be honest, like they were to a certain degree, they were already starting to, show wear at the seams, essentially blew themselves up, all of them, obviously, the Russian Empire, really the royal house of Germany, the Ottomans, everyone kind of essentially like demolished their entire stock of, treasure, their best and brightest. And so to me, that seems to be largely unrelated to America. Obviously, America entered the war, but at least from my perspective, we didn't really have to do much with it starting. And so obviously the rot post that, you can say a lot of it is our fault. And I don't disagree with that, especially post World War II. That seems largely incontrovertible. But we can't deny that essentially like we, as the West, put ourselves here. We're the ones who essentially spent all of our, our entire patrimony in 100 years of what, and I realized that obviously like we can't give the USG, too much cover. Like there's active evil in that, like you quoted,
Yeah.
And I'll get it right. Madeleine Albright, not Madison. But, essentially saying like, oh, well, it was worth it. The 600,000 children who died, it was worth it. I'm not in any way trying to justify that. But like, we got ourselves here. All of us got ourselves here. And there's a certain amount where it's like, I don't mean to by any means excuse the US government. we need to look at what they've done, soberly and rationally. But also there's another part where it's like, at what point does looking for a culprit like kind of excuse people who kind of actively made things worse, before that? Do you see what I mean?
Indeed. And we have this very scary sort of political formula in which we claim to be responsible for the actions of our government. And that's, I think, as good a reason as any to disavow the political process at this point. I don't think our government is capable of making choices that we can morally countenance. Well, and I really do not want to be held responsible. I don't want to face Judgment Day and answer for the actions of my government. I want to register myself as a very profound dissident. I was against it. But my goodness, what can you do to prove that you're against it and still live in this country? It's a real shame. I mean, does this mean that Republican voters that elected George W. Bush should be judged for Guantanamo, for Abu Ghraib? The implications are really serious. I take them seriously.
And I'm comfortable recognizing that there are acts which are necessary for statecraft that would not be justifiable if you or I did them, right? I understand that. But there is something, there's just a profound like wastefulness to it. Like say what you will about, kind of, and obviously these are true to a lesser or greater extent. Like Caesar killed an awful lot of Gauls. But in doing that, he did, to a certain degree, kind of bring, glory and riches back home. And I realized that obviously I doubt that was, motivated by a sense of kind of like, charity. And that obviously wasn't necessarily the best thing for Rome in the long term. But it's kind of like this massive, this incredibly destructive, evil empire is being run, kind of like a counter, in opposition to the people it allegedly was founded by. It's like it's incredibly perverse. And this actually goes back to the first ever episode of this show, episode 0 with Paul Fahrenheit, where we essentially talked about kind of the American, Southern, white man as more or less like the Janissary class of the empire. We were and obviously not me personally, I was never involved, but a lot of people your age, a lot of my friends are in your age group, who were kind of in high school, plus or minus when 9/11 happened, essentially got kind of chewed up and spit out by this. Like there were multiple people I know who were, in college when I was in grade school, who were either, veterans coming back on GI Bill or, were about to go out. And a lot of those guys who I'm still friends with, if they made it through are incredibly broken. And really, like, for what? And it's hard not to look at that. And I realize like there's a human cost to any war. There's no denying that. But the cost versus the benefit is just, it's not even close.
I never thought that I would relate to the decadent Brits who were cheering for the collapse of the British Empire after World War II. Watching the garrisons withdrawn from India, for instance, and praising the likes of Gandhi. I thought of them as pitiful until the collapse in Afghanistan. And then I felt like I understood those Brits for the very first time. And I guess I really wish that we had the wherewithal to use our will to assert our destiny under these circumstances. But in the meantime, I guess I take some heart in signs of collapse because we don't believe lies as much after we see them fail, and no one can deny it. And it ought to deprive the empire of energy and assent. It discredits them. Things like Afghanistan discredit them. And it's not that I am cheering on the Taliban. Okay, it's not that I want to give them energy or strength or power or anything else. But I don't want the empire to have that kind of legitimacy. I thought, based on what you just shared, that I would go through one series of conversation from AA's cigar stream, and perhaps we can exchange some opinions about that and then wrap things up. This had to do with something that you were mentioning. You and I were both reflecting about how the rot in the American tradition really does seem to start after World War II. There was broad consensus on that point on the cigar stream, with both the Britishers and the Americans in agreement, it seems to me. So AA said the rot sets in around 1950. Yiz then said that this distracts from her point. She was speaking of a certain intellectual minority group, which she credits for a lot of the harm in the American project, especially the anti-whiteness. And she said that in antebellum America, we had many distinct groups of people. And that is quite true. The whole propositional nation thesis does not get started until Lincoln's rhetorical flourish in the Gettysburg Address. Americans did not talk of themselves that way. They spoke of themselves as natives of their states. So AA then responds, and he said, so the United States is not a true nation then. And Yiz agreed and said, yes, correct. There are many nations. She said, we were functional up until 1860. Then she goes back to the anti-whiteness thesis again. She says, anti-whites are the virus, not the empire or DC. So academic agent then goes back to the ethnic thesis once more. And he says, well, who cares about the fake nation of the USA? In that case, if you say it was something that was made up, that the propositional thesis is incorrect. At this point, Paul Fahrenheit interjected and said, he must disagree. He said, in the early republic, we were more like Europe. And you could say that we had traditional ethnic groups up until the Civil War, though there was talk of some kind of national collective identity. In this, I think Paul is correct. I would like to clarify. Then Paul comes out with a more controversial thesis. He said secession and the whole attempt for the South to establish itself as another country was suicidal, like World War I for Americans. And that secession today would create worse entropy, and it would impoverish us materially. I agree it would impoverish us materially, but I insist that there are far more valuable things we stand to preserve by political breakup, political, cultural, economic breakup. Yes, we would lose our standard of living, but I say we're losing it anyway.
Well, right. And a common refrain in these circles is, essentially we want to cease treating our homes as economic zones, right? Essentially all that America or all that Britain means is essentially like a square plot of land with a certain tax code. But we've got to realize that if we intend to reject that, if we intend to reject, globalism and kind of like line go up economics, that's not a free, that costs you something. And to a certain degree, like a lot of us have kind of, and I speak even myself, right, sitting on a desk I ordered from Amazon have gotten addicted to kind of like the comforts of that. And look, I agree with you that if we want to decouple ourselves from that, if we want to break down, this unwieldy empire into smaller units, like that will come with a decrease in complexity and a decrease in essentially like consumer purchasing power, to put it in a very blunt way.
I really do believe our quality of life is set to take a serious hit. But we ought to respond to that with the character to develop spiritual strength. Now is the time to develop spiritual virtues. We need that more than ever. We have been relying on materialism and lifestyles that we can purchase off the shelf to fill spiritual voids for far too long. And the price has been tremendous. We're facing many of the consequences of those addictions at this point. But we don't need economic prosperity. We do not need GDP growth. Measuring progress by GDP is, here's another controversial thesis for you. I say that that's part of the imperial system that's ultimately based on a lie. We aren't constantly measuring the consumption of our citizenry as a substitute for their actual happiness. That's just false. That's not how it works. Other things that actually make life worth living, the culture that actually makes life worth living, is based on things like loyalties, faith, your comfortableness in your own skin, which evidently is something that more and more Americans simply cannot live with. They need surgeons and hormones and such to change these things. Not to mention, all the other sorts of mind-altering drugs that we hear so much about these days. We're very uncomfortable these days, and it's a sign of our spiritual unhealthiness. We don't feel comfortable in our land. We don't feel comfortable with our people, with our own families. We need a spiritual comfortableness, and we don't need more money for that. I think more money has made it worse. More conveniences, more luxuries may make it all worse. Our ancestors did not need very much in order to keep families together, in order to raise children, in order to educate them. Go read their newspapers, for heaven's sake. These people could read and write far better than we can typically. And they raised the standard. They were not constantly dumbing it all down. There was a time when the entropy was not visible in things that people actually wrote. Whereas now, things like texting and such have done such a number on our ability to communicate clearly and effectively, and even to spell our own language anymore. So my contention, we don't need more money. We don't need more prosperity in economics. We need spiritual revival at this point in our history. But I'm afraid we are going to go through a season of serious despair before then. I think the despair will be made of those who really believe in the empire. They see their ideals all wound up in it somehow. And a lot of these people are people that I have so much affection for, flag-waving people, right? People who sing country songs, people that go and tailgate and say, I'm proud to be an American, where at least I know I'm free, kind of, right? It's very pitiful slogan, it seems to me. At least I know I'm free.
It is. I mean, especially now. And it's never a comforting realization that there isn't really a realistic past, a realistic path forward where we essentially get to keep all of the things that we like. We have to give up something. And look, like that's probably good for us. It's just that what's good for you isn't always pleasant. And so I don't mean to come across as too black-pilled. I'm not saying to say it's all pointless, just neck yourself. But I think that if we can kind of draw a conclusion from it, it's that, well, things are probably going to get better before they get worse. But, hopefully they will eventually get better.
Indeed.
Well, anyway, Bagby, I'm sorry. I'm reaching the end of my endurance. Like I said earlier, I'm feeling a little bit under the weather. Is there anything you want to say before we wrap things up?
Just that patriotism is a duty. And again, we should reflect that without love of country, a man is unable to create. I think that is profoundly true. I'm not hating on America. I love America. That the parts of it that I know, I don't belong anywhere else. What am I supposed to do? I mean, to go to Costa Rica or something would be utterly alienating. No one should want Americans to be alienated from their own patrimony. To do so is to geld them. Okay, they would be worth nothing if they were to be alienated. We have to find something here. And I think there's a lot to love, by the way. I'm not saying that it's difficult. Well, just find some good teachers, okay? Don't get teachers that hate it. There are plenty of those. Distinguish, all right? But love where you are. Learn the story of your people. Learn the story of your place. And love it. That goes for you Australians out there, whatever strange place you might live in. We have a basic duty to do that. And my initial beef with AA was that it seemed to me he wanted Americans to be alienated. I know better than that now. That's not what he was talking about, and he did clarify himself, and I want to give him credit for that. But that is a basic duty for us. And if we have any hope for our beliefs, it must include a patriotism. So that's my theme this evening. I really appreciate coming on, and I really do hope you feel better, Jay.
Oh, it's all right. I'm going to the doctor tomorrow, so I'll be better one way or another. Just my determination never to go to the doctor lasted exactly 48 hours.
Oh dear. Well,
anyway,
my goodness,
guys,
I hope you do feel better than that.
Oh yeah, I'll be fine. Anyway, guys, obviously, this episode is going up on YouTube right now, but it will, very soon be on anywhere you listen to audio only shows. So Apple, Spotify. I'm trying out a new scheme to essentially to monetize the show by having the shows always be free on my YouTube, and the most recent 10 episodes will always be free on Apple and Spotify, anywhere you listen to audio shows. And then after they kind of fall out of the top 10, they go behind a simple $5 a month paywall at my Substack. And that's not a huge benefit, but it is a nice way to access the backlog while you're out away from your computer. And then other than that, I should be recording with Liz soon, with Todd Lewis, and sooner or later, and obviously I don't want to spoil it, I might be on Thomas's show Mind Phaser. So we got a lot coming up, and thank you guys for coming out, and keep your head up, guys. The light can't last forever. Good night.